Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, February 22nd, 2021, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santamaria, and we have a great guest for you this week. But before we dive into the show, I want to thank all of you who continue to make Talk Nerdy 100% free to download. I work on this show all by my lonesome. I shouldn't say all by my lonesome. It feels like it because I'm here at my house all alone, but I really rely on the support of my incredible executive assistant, Noelle, and of the team at Pro Podcast Solutions who edit the show for me. And in order to hire that support, I rely on the patronage of individuals just like you. If you're interested in pledging your support, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy, and you can learn all about how. Everything from $1 an episode on up is really, really helpful. And remember, in pledging your support for this show, you're helping offset the cost so that anybody who, is not in a position to do so can listen to the show. Again, 100, that's how you say that word, percent free. This week's top patrons include Michael Gaucher, Mary Neva, Leonard Prince, Christopher Pitts, June Sapara, Pasquale Gelati, Ulrika Hagman, Dudas Infinitus, Brian Holden, Pedro M. Rosario Barbosa, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Robert Christ, and Elise Christie. Thank you all so, so much. There are other ways to pledge your support, to show your support. You can visit the Talk Nerdy store through my website, or you can go directly to it at talknerdymerch.com. And of course, you can rate and review on the different platforms where you listen to the show. So iTunes, or Apple Podcasts, I think it's called now, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, anywhere that you download the show, you can rate it, and that always helps climb us in the charts and get more eyeballs on it. All right, enough about me. Let's talk about Dr. Ainissa Ramirez. I'm so excited to have her on the show this week. She is an award-winning scientist, actually a materials scientist, and an incredible science communicator who has been working tirelessly to get the general public excited about science. She, as I mentioned, has been awarded prizes from the National Science Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, MIT, and the American Institute of Physics. She has served as a science advisor to the American Film Institute, to WGBH NOVA, and to the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and several science museums. She also hosts a great science podcast called Science Underground, and she has a new book out, which I'm so excited to say recently won the AAAS Subaru Book Prize. This is very exciting. Her new book is called The Alchemy of Us: How Humans and Matter Transformed One Another. So we're going to learn all about our relationship with stuff, and not just how we made that stuff, but how that stuff in turn changed the way that we operate within the world. This is a fascinating chat. And without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Ainissa Ramirez. Well, Ainissa, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I'm really excited to talk about your new book, which just days ago or just today won the AAAS Subaru Book Prize.
Well, it's officially announced because the AAAS conference is going on this week.
Oh,
yeah.
Love it.
Yeah.
Oh, gosh, that's already happening. Wait a minute. I was at AAAS last year, right as the pandemic was probably cycling through all of us because it was in Seattle, but none of us knew. Right. And looking back, I'm like, that feels like it was 10 years ago.
No, that was a year ago. It's happening now. Yeah. That's what COVID does. It erases time.
Oh my gosh. But how exciting. So they announced it this week. You got the award in the mail, and gosh, off to the races. Like what an honor.
Oh, such an honor. I mean, I have warm fuzzies for AAAS because long ago I was a mass media fellow, which is they allowed grad students to go to different media outlets like newspapers, and I did that while I was in graduate school. So I always had an affinity for AAAS, and this is just like full circle to actually win this prize, given a skill that I kind of learned because of them.
Oh, that's so cool. So I am actually still in graduate school. I don't want to say still. I went back to graduate school after taking like 10 or 12 years off. Thank you.
That's right. Good for you.
little scary. And so it's been a bit since you've been in graduate school, but what did you actually study when you were a grad student?
Well, 100 years ago when I was in graduate school, I was in the Bay Area, and when I was at Stanford, a lot of graduate students were working in industry, solving industry problems. So
Hmm.
I was at Hewlett Packard, HP, and they were in the hard disk business, and we were trying to figure out how to make hard disks more reliable. And so I was interested in the materials that made the surface of the hard disk more robust. And spent too much time thinking about carbon and magnetic layers and hard disks. And yeah, and if your hard disk is surviving today, well, that's because of me. You're welcome.
That's so cool. And then even after that, you went on to continue working as a material scientist, right?
I did, and I was on the fence because I was at Stanford and I was in California, and people don't leave California. In fact, I'm originally from New Jersey, and I pretty much told my mom I'm not coming back. But I don't know what happened, but Bell Laboratories, which is in New Jersey, had opened up positions, which they hadn't done in a long time. And so I threw my hat in the ring for a postdoc, and they hired me as a full-time scientist. And I was like, well, you can't turn that down. That would be a
Right.
mistake. So I went back to New Jersey, which I said I'd never would do. And I've been on the East Coast, which is the coast that I grew up on anyway. But I've been on the East Coast since.
Oh, wow. And so what kinds of stuff do they do at Bell Labs, or what were you specifically focusing on back then?
Well, Bell Labs, the reason why I went back is because Bell Labs is pretty much a candy shop for a material scientist.
Mm.
Transistors, the things that make up your computer, that was created at Bell Laboratories. And the first week that I got there, I went to see the laboratory where it happened, and I took a picture. That's the kind of geek I am. And so things that, lasers, a lot of things that we take for granted happened there. And what I was working on was they're called micro machines. You can make small devices that are about the thickness of your hair. And, these small devices allowed us to miniaturize things and make things that were once huge and expensive and took up a lot of power can be now very small and take up very little power. So, but when you do that, materials act differently. And so I was trying to figure out how the materials behave when they're very, very small.
Oh, interesting. And so what came from that?
Well, if I tell you, I have to kill you. No, no. What
A
came
great
from that is
answer.
we found some very interesting things. When you make something very, very small, as I said, it behaves differently. Also, when
Mhm.
you put metals together, you know, when you put metals together on a very, very small scale, weird things happen. Two metals together, that actually sets up a battery and things corrode. Things that you would
Mm.
have ignored if it was huge. Like if I put a block of metal A next to a block of metal B, you wouldn't really care, maybe over the course of 10 years. But when it's very thin, that is, the thickness of your hair, things are magnified in terms of their effect. So we had to deal with wrangling materials at a very, very small scale. And it required learning new things about materials along the way.
That's fascinating. And so you studied material science, you worked as a material scientist, but you've really sampled kind of what a lot of academia has to offer because you also have found yourself back in academia, both at Yale and MIT, right?
Right, right. So Bell Labs, I would have stayed at Bell Labs forever, but the telecom bubble burst. And
Hmm.
so many scientists were scrambling for positions. And here I am, a junior scientist, and there are top scientists, and they're getting the best jobs in New Jersey because people want to stay local. They have kids that are going to school. And so I'm in competition with them. And I was actually doing okay. And I said, this was the time that I actually wanted to go into academia anyway, because I was teaching at Columbia while I was at Bell Laboratories. So I thought I was kind of being an academic, meaning teaching and doing research. So I
Hmm.
said, I think I'm ready. So I started looking and I landed a position at Yale. And it's very different because the job is more than just teaching and research. It's really raising money and doing stuff within the university. Lots and lots of work. I did that for
Right.
about 10 years. And along the way, I also had a couple of sabbaticals, and I took those sabbaticals at MIT. And that's where I really went back to being like at Bell Laboratories, where I just did research and, did where I did research and did a little bit of teaching, not very much. but I was able to go back to just the research part. But after about 10 years or so, it really became clear that this is not what I enjoy doing. I really love the teaching part. I
Mm.
wasn't enjoying the research part so much. So it was time to
Yeah.
make a change.
It's interesting for the science communicators that I know well who come from academia, because there does seem to be kind of, I don't want to call it a split. There's so much crossover, but there's a chunk of science communicators and science journalists who sort of came up through J school or
Mm,
came up through the writing side of things. And then there's the sci-commers and the sci journalists who sort of came up through science and
hmm
academia and went into public science communication. And I find that a common refrain amongst a lot of them is I either realized I didn't want to be a bench scientist, or I realized that I was kind of done with it because I put in my dues. And I love teaching so much, I wanted to expand to this larger audience. Did you feel like that was sort of your experience as well?
Absolutely. My teaching evaluations were off the chart. And I also had a science program for kids while I was at Yale called Science Saturdays. And in the month of October and April, we brought in kids and we had lectures and we had demonstrations and we had goodies. And I got to buy all these science toys. I was having a blast in the month of April and October. And then when
Mm,
those months weren't around, I noticed that my energy level was low. And then when
right.
October or April came, my energy was off the chart again. And I did this for about 7 years. And I said, wait a minute. Hmm, here's some data. Your energy's off the chart when you're doing this outreach stuff. And when you're not doing it, it's kind of low again. So I said, well, I think that's where I should direct my energy. So yeah, I had a similar brain to as your colleagues had. But I think I was just getting some data. This is where I got energized, and that there's also other ways to become being a scientist, and it's not just a bench laboratory scientist, as we're told.
Right. And so now as a psychommer, you give talks, you have a TED talk, you write articles for a lot of science outlets that many of the people listening to the podcast listen to on a regular basis. You do your own podcast. Can you tell me a little bit about like when you started your podcast and how that's going?
Oh, well, I started my podcast. Ooh, when did I do that? I want to say 2015 I started.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
yeah, I started 2015. But the reason why I started is because I was writing a book. I had written Newton's Football, and that it did okay. That came out in 2013. I was writing another book that was material science related and was shopping that around 2014. And nobody wanted it. It got,
Mm,
and nobody wanted it. And my agent said, this project is dead. And I
mm.
was absolutely heartbroken. So I did what everybody does when they're heartbroken. I started a podcast.
Oh my
So
God. That
that's
so
where
speaks to me.
so that's where Science Underground came from. It's a 2-minute podcast. I love supporting science teachers. So it's a 2-minute science podcast because I wanted teachers to use it, to bring kids into the classroom, to use it at the beginning of the classroom so that they can get them engaged with a topic and then cover whatever material that I'm discussing in the podcast. And I enjoyed it because I got to talk to a whole lot of cool people. Jerry Rice, football player who I enjoy speaking to, and many others. So it was a great avenue to meet a lot of people. But I really, in my gut, wanted to get that book written. So the podcast has taken a little pause because I actually got that book to happen.
So this has been a labor of love for quite some time, The Alchemy of Us.
Oh, it certainly is. It took me 5 years to write it, and that's
Mm,
5 years. I would say 4.5 years full time, where
wow.
it's just me and the book, and a library bench somewhere.
And it really is, well, first of all, it's a triumph. And it's also, I think, really well curated. I guess one of the things that stands out to me is how beautifully you were able to say, and I assume this didn't happen overnight, these are some of the core technologies that we as human beings developed utilizing our own ingenuity. But then in turn, those technologies really shape the way we live on this planet. How did you pick amongst, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of things that have been invented, that have been
Mhm.
developed to focus on the ones that you focus on in the book?
Well, The Alchemy of Us is a material science book, but it's also a book of argumentation. And I was looking for 8 cases that supported my theme, which is how technology shaped us. And each chapter starts off with some historical vignette where that material was critical because it existed or did not exist, and that historical event may or may not have happened. And then the second part of the chapter will have the origin story of who was the inventor who made this happen. And the last part is the most important part, is how that technology shaped us. Now, finding 3 parts for different inventions is difficult to do. And sometimes I would have 2, or I would have a very good one and I didn't have the others. And sometimes the stories just weren't interesting enough, I thought, to general audiences. I might have been interested, but I was like, maybe I'm just the only one who really thinks that this is hot. So it was really a matter of finding 8 cases that showed this, 8 strong stories, and 8 historical events that really were significant in order to bring this book about.
And it's interesting because I think if we were to throw this question out to most people, like what in your life is a technology that's utilized that really has changed your behavior, a lot of people would probably talk about their smartphones. And I assume that's because for many of us, or at least us who are over the age of, I don't know, 20, there was a before time and an after time. We know what it was like to not have
Right.
one, and then we
Right.
remember the change. And you, of course, focus in your book on 2 things that are fundamental to the cell phone, but really even more than that: hard drives and silicon chips. But even beyond that, it's funny how rarely we think about some of the earlier technologies that you focus on amongst your 8 inventions. Things like light bulbs,
Right.
clocks, rails, steel rails. Like, we often don't think about those things because they're so fundamental to our lives that it's almost as if we evolved with them, which
Right.
we absolutely didn't.
Right. We think they've always existed, but
Yeah.
no, someone came up with that idea, and as simple as it may seem, life changed because of that. And as you say, I do remember life before cell phones, and I know this life today, and I'm not sure which life I like better. I think I actually like the one before cell phones, to be honest. But, I didn't want that to be the premise of the book. I wanted to show technologies that we don't even think about and show how they've impacted us. Of course, our cell phones and future technologies like AI are going to impact us. But the telegraph, the light bulb, let's look at those things. So if we can look at simple inventions and see how they've shaped us, then we can be a little bit more critical about these more advanced technologies that are on the horizon.
So when we take those 8 technologies or those 8 inventions, and I don't even know if inventions encapsulates it perfectly, because I guess, yes, there was a time when the thing existed when before that it didn't exist. But of course,
Mhm.
as we know, big inventions like clocks or like photographic film, it's not just one thing. It's
Right,
an accumulation of so much thought and so much innovation.
right.
Which of these is the oldest? Which of the 8 things that you focus on is kind of the first change that we saw amongst them?
Well, the Alchemy of Us is actually in chronological order. So the first chapter is clocks, and clocks are quite old. We told time by the position of the sun. With the shade using, we use hourglasses. So clocks have been around for some time. But what I talk about are mechanical clocks that you wind up, and also clocks that use quartz gems inside. So the first chapter is clocks, and as I said, it's chronologically ordered.
And so as you were diving into the clock and really the not just the materials and the science and technology that went into developing them, but as you mentioned, the kind of fundamental social change that they incurred, the individual experiential change that they incurred, you also do something that you do throughout the book, which is that you celebrate some of the lesser known individuals whose ingenuity and whose really perseverance in the face of a pretty limiting, I'm saying that very nicely, cruel world, they were able to make an impact. And I'm specifically pointing to, of course, women, people of color, just minorities, which still exist. Those are still minorities within the sciences.
Mhm.
But at the time, it was, almost unheard of for women and people of color to be making profound contributions and, of course, didn't get their due, which is why we haven't heard of a lot of the people that you talk about in the book.
Right. It wasn't unheard of. It was just unrecognized. And
Right.
so when I was writing the book, so I'm African American, and when I was writing the book, I was having a tough time writing a book where I wasn't in it at all. And
Mm.
that's probably the first incarnation of the book that I was writing. But the world changed. We had a presidential administration that just made it very clear that I couldn't write that book. I wasn't even interested in writing that book because I would be perpetuating these stereotypes of who is a genius and who does science. And so that's why it took a long time to write this book, because I had to dig deep to find these stories. I had to, the first person that you meet in The Alchemy of Us is Ruth Belville. And I found her in a very, very thick book. She was one sentence in a very, very thick book on horology, the study of timepieces. And when I saw that sentence, that put me on the path to figure out who she was. Now, if I wasn't paying attention or if I didn't have caffeine that day, I might have missed her. So this is the reason why the book took so long to write. And again, when I saw her, I said, well, I have to tell your story because actually you're the most fascinating thing I've found in this book on timepieces. Ruth Belville had this position where she sold time. She would go and get the precise time at the Royal Observatory, and then she would walk around to different parts of London because they needed to know the precise time, but they didn't have the access or the time to go to the Royal Observatory to get it. And I found her fascinating. I mean, a woman who sold time, that sounds like fiction, but no, her family had been doing that for 100 years. She provided a service.
A
And
very entrepreneurial I guess
exactly.
it sounds, you're right. It sounds creative and fantastic to us now. At the time, it was probably absolutely necessary, and maybe people didn't even think it was strange. But how
No, it was actually
innovative!
life-saving. It was actually
Yeah,
life-saving because navigators who were on ships, they needed the precise time because this is how they determine longitude. They needed the precise time in London, and then they would know the time it was on the ship by the position of the sun, and this would tell them where they were on the map. If they had the wrong time, then they would get very, very lost. They may not make their destination. So it sounds crazy to us today for someone to sell time, but she provided a fantastic service.
yeah, it's just brilliant. And you know, I kind of want to skip around a little bit because the idea, obviously, here is not to tell the whole story of the book, but to get people excited and kind of whet their appetite for it. Are there others? Obviously, there's so many interesting characters that you profile throughout the telling of these stories. And you organize the book, of course, by these 8 different innovations, these 8 different inventions. But for you personally, maybe thinking about your own journey and your own path within academia, within industry, and of course within this kind of weird world of science communication that we find ourselves. Is there anybody, or are there a few people who really stick out to you, who resonated with you, where you were like, wow, I kind of almost see myself in them?
Absolutely. There's a chapter called Chapter 4 called Capture, which is about photography. There's a story about 2 African American employees who worked at Polaroid in 1970, and they found that their employer was selling their camera technology for instant photographs to South Africa, which had an apartheid system. And their cameras were a way to monitor and control the whereabouts of Black South Africans during when it was a police state. Now, I found out about that story, and I actually got to meet one of the employees. Her name is Caroline Hunter. And there are accounts of what she and her colleague Ken Williams did in order to convince Polaroid to stop selling their cameras to to South Africa. And if you read those accounts, they come off as rabid people, and they're written by people who worked for Polaroid at the time. But their side of the story had not been told. And so I actually got to meet Caroline, and I said, tell me your story. And then I went to the archives where Polaroid's materials were and got to read what was formerly confidential materials, and so I can build and tell this story. So the story about Polaroid's involvement in South Africa is probably the most important thing I've written.
Wow. And did you have any idea or any, I guess, interest in diving deep into a social justice component as you were setting out to write your book?
No, not at all. When I was initially writing that chapter called Capture on photography, The thing I was really interested in was I wanted to showcase this preacher, this Episcopalian preacher named Hannibal Goodwin, who had created early camera film before George Eastman. Because usually when you hear about camera film, you hear about George Eastman, but you didn't know that this Episcopalian preacher actually beat him in terms of developing it first and also winning the patent suit, although Hannibal Goodwin had passed away before that happened. So I was excited to tell that story. But as I kept digging in the world of photography, I stumbled onto this Polaroid story, and I was like, wait a minute, hold on, what's going on? And I said, well, this is far more compelling. I mean, I love Hannibal Goodwin's story, but this is really important. And so, no, I wasn't really looking for a social justice story. I knew I might stumble onto it because science happens within the context of our human lives. But this is particularly important because photography is something that we so love. And here it is. Here is a case where it's been used in a nefarious way. So that's why I thought this was an important story to tell.
It's true. I feel like so often, especially in sort of modern science communication, where the hope is, and I do see this amongst a lot of kind of social justice oriented thinkers, that there is a renewed interest and a renewed kind of energy to tell the stories of sort of the forgotten superheroes, the hidden figures.
Mm-hmm.
We see often a push to uncover a little bit of the darkness that these individual thinkers were trapped beneath. But what we rarely get to see is the nefarious side. I recently had Angela Saini on the show, and of course, she wrote an entire book about sort of the horrible race science, quote unquote, whether you want to call it race pseudoscience or race science in quotes, but the horrible way that science has actually been used to disenfranchise, to denigrate, to torture, to perpetuate systemic racism. And those stories aren't told as often. And do you think it's because they're confronting? Do you think it's because of kind of the white fragility that is so common in our culture? I do feel like, we can celebrate a Black scientist or a woman scientist who didn't get her due, and everybody's very happy with that. But when we tell these very confronting stories, the feedback isn't always the same.
No, scientists don't want to think about that. They don't want to think about the impact of their work. I talk to scientists quite a bit, and they're really thrilled about solving a problem. And then I'll ask, how do you think this will live in the world? And they haven't even considered that. They spent a lot of time on solving the problem, but not even a few seconds on how this will live in the world. And it's not solely their fault. That's not how we teach science. We teach science where people are just going to solve a problem. But the next thing that we need to do is, okay, this will live in the world. How will it impact people? And that's the reason why I wrote this book, so that people will start to consider technology, not just the development of that technology, but let's also put that technology under the microscope and see how it would behave and how humans will behave once this technology is around.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of, I recently had the honor to moderate a little panel for Amazon
Mm,
Studios about the new film Radioactive, which is all about Marie Curie and
mhm,
her contributions to science. And so I was talking to the director, and I was talking to the actress Rosamund Pike, who plays Marie Curie in the book. And one of the big themes that we ended up focusing on in this panel is exactly what you were talking about. The way that the director grappled in the film with the effects of
mm,
the discovery of radium.
mhm,
The positive things that came, nuclear therapies,
mhm,
radiotherapies for cancer,
mhm,
and the negative, ultimately the bomb, ultimately these
mhm,
treatments that people were taking that they thought would give them health and vitality that led to their cancer and led to their illness. And we hear the classic stories of, Oppenheimer. We hear these big picture stories about
mhm.
those kinds of grapplings, but you're so right. With everything comes a valence. It comes a positive effect and a negative effect. And even going back, let's say, to the light bulb, maybe
Mhm.
you can enlighten us a little bit about some of what you discovered as you were researching the invention of the light bulb and how profoundly it changed the way that we exist in the world?
Well, that's a great question. If you had asked me that question about 7 years ago, my lecture on the light bulb would have been, well, here's on and here's off. Thank you for coming. But while talking to many different scientists, it ends up that our bodies have a connection to the light. Our bodies actually have two modes. We have a daytime mode and a nighttime mode. In our daytime mode, we have an increase in temperature, an increase in metabolism, and an increase in the amount of growth hormone going through our bodies. In our nighttime mode, all those values decrease. How our body knows what mode to be in is dependent on the lights. See, our eyes, we thought everything there was to know about the eye had been known for the last 200 years. Like, it just sees, it's for vision. But it ends up that the eye has a special photoreceptor which picks up blue light, and it's not used for vision. It's sort of like a detector. When it sees blue light, it tells another part of the brain to stop secreting melatonin, which tells our bodies it's a chemical compound, puts everything in nighttime mode. So when it's shut off, we enter into daytime mode. Now, when the eye sees blue light, we go into daytime mode. Now, when Edison was creating his light bulbs, and I will say that he wasn't the only inventor of the light bulb, his aim was to push back the darkness. But now we know that there's a health effect. And if you're in daytime mode, that is, if you're surrounded by blue light, there'll be a lot of growth hormone going through your bodies, and your body will respond. The cells will respond to this overstimulation. And the reason why we know is that epidemiologists have done studies, and they've looked at how people get sick, what they do, where they live, and they see that there's this population of people that get sick when they work, and they work at night underneath the electric lights, which are very, very blue. So the light bulb, we don't even think about it, on, off, actually impacts our health. And this is one of the things that I discuss in the Alchemy of Us.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think that so often a new technology, which of course we almost don't even have to list the incredible impact, the kind of the positive side of something like the light bulb. It just allowed for so much more invention, or intervention. I love it. Invention,
Well,
innovation.
you just invented a word. This is what we do here.
Absolutely. But yeah, it opens so many doors that it's almost like difficult to even make a long list of them. But
Right.
that there is this kind of this unforeseen side of it that then ultimately led to even newer technologies like different color temperatures in light
Right.
bulbs.
Right.
Like I have things around my home, I have a little light in the bathroom that turns on when I get up to use the bathroom at night that only glows a nice amber hue so as not to wake me up
Great.
at night.
Sweet.
Yeah, I even have a cool thing on my computer called Flux, F.Lux, which is, an evidence-based program that you add to your computer. You tell it what time you go to sleep at night, what time you wake up, and it gradually reddens and darkens your screen
I
so
love it.
that it's a natural progression as if the sun were setting and we were working by candlelight.
I love
Um,
it. That sounds
I love
great.
it too. And these
Mhm.
are kinds of things that, of course, scientists who look at the big picture and the downstream effects, say, how can we mitigate some of the negative
Right,
effects
right, right. It's
of
it's
incredible
again, it's
technology?
about thinking about your invention in context. I mean, it was very
Yeah.
hard to make the blue LED. In fact, it was so hard it got the Nobel Prize in 2014. That's no joke.
Mm.
It took a lot of effort from these researchers. I've been reading about the blue LEDs. That's fine. But now that the blue LEDs in our lives and we want light, how do we live in a mindful way? So we need these kinds of technologies, as you mentioned, that changes the temperature so that it's redder in the evenings and it's bluer during the day. Edison didn't know that, but we do now, and so we should support products that help us live in a healthy way underneath the lights.
And I think we see that, a lot in sort of our modern um 24-hour news cycle. As you know, as somebody who writes for a lot of science outlets, how hard it can be to pitch a story, to keep up with what's, in the news cycle, to get something that's like newer and, nobody's thought about it that way published. But because of that, in a way, we have the privilege, I guess we could say, of thinking about ethics, thinking about downstream effects.
Mhm,
We are
mhm.
in many ways more mindful about that than we were in the past, although many things slip through our consciousness based on our based on our kind of perspectives that we maintain. But I think about things like CRISPR. I think about,
Mm-hmm.
these, even like the mRNA vaccines, and
Mm-hmm.
how important it is for us to think about what is this amazing technology allowing for us to do, and what are the ways that it could be misused, and how can we
Absolutely.
ethically put up, blocks for that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think about that. I look at CRISPR with a little bit of side eye. I think that it's great. It got the Nobel Prize. I follow the Nobel Prizes, but we've already seen some misuses, and there aren't any stopgaps to prevent that. There's no oversight for these technologies. A bad acting scientist can do whatever he or she wants to do. And so that's why I think it's important to inform the public so that they can push back a little bit since we don't have oversight. So, maybe it's just that's my point of view. Maybe it's because I grew up in New Jersey. Anything that's new, I just have a little bit of side eye. I'm like, okay, how can this go wrong? And I think maybe everyone should just adopt a little bit of that.
Yeah, that prudent paranoia, that
Mm, like it.
skepticism, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. And as somebody who's worked in material science for so long, and as somebody who really was working in material science in the computer era, and
Mm-hmm.
so, working on the types of technologies, probably more from the hardware side, but that work with the software to really affect change. You did cover two of those important technologies in the book, but even beyond that, I want to dive into those two technologies. But I'd love to ask, because we're talking about this precipice where we are right now at the bleeding edge. Do you feel similarly about things like AI and neural networks? Is your side eye pretty severe about these kinds
Pretty,
of
pretty
yeah?
much. Pretty much. Anytime I hear, I have a knee jerk reaction when I hear AI. I'm like, uh oh, what happened now? I know, and the thing is that I can see the fun parts of these technologies, but there's so many ways that it can go wrong. And we've already seen evidence for it, and we haven't done anything. And it's only going to get worse. It's like a cavity. It doesn't get better. It's only going to get worse. And we don't have venues to correct behavior. We don't have, like I mentioned, any way of oversight. And people aren't really informed about it because AI is just so hard to grasp. And so this is the reason why I wrote about simpler technologies. Like we can kind of understand how a light bulb works. And what I want to empower people to do is just ask questions. We may not get the answers, but we need to be pushing back with questions because otherwise more and more of these technologies will just be introduced. And, as I said, because there's no oversight, they'll just continue to be introduced. But if we ask questions and say, hey, is that a good idea? Is this a good idea? Is this a good idea? Well, then we'll have to get answers. And that will require those who are originating these technologies to come up with good answers.
Right. It really does need to be baked into the actual process of
Mhm.
invention.
Mhm. It should actually
Yeah.
it needs to be integral.
Mhm.
As you're putting things together, the question should also be, how is this going to live in the world? It shouldn't be like, isn't it cool? And then hit send. And then think about,
Right.
oh, how how's it going to live? It should be much, much earlier on. But the way that we do tech now, it's like we push to ship and then we worry about ethics when there's pushback from the public or from the government.
Right, and sometimes that can be too late, like,
It's
real
way too
damage can
late.
be done.
Yeah, way
Yeah.
too late. It's already part of the culture. Nobody wants it removed. And so you can put in some
Right.
patches, but it might, it really needs to be very, very early on.
And this is, of course, I mean, we see this with Facebook, we see this with
Absolutely.
massive privacy concerns, with giant
Absolutely.
hacks and data leaks. Absolute. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And so kind of going back to the simpler technologies that you mentioned, I'd love to talk a little bit about the technologies that are really near and dear to your heart, the ones that you have physically worked on in laboratories and then got to talk about in the book. Is there anything, I mean, there's a lot we can talk about, but the question that comes up for me is, especially with those technologies, is there anything that as you started to dig into your research, because of course, sometimes people think that when you sit down to write a book, it's like, I have all of this knowledge in my mind, I will now put it on the page. But really, writing a
Mm-mm.
book is investigative journalism. It's
It
digging
really
deep.
is. It really is. And I would also say, because we were just talking about the fast news cycles, the great thing
Mm,
about a book is that it's a different time scale. This acceleration of covering things in the news and the acceleration of making things in science doesn't allow us to give us the time to critically think about things, but a book does.
mhm.
And so I knew about these technologies such as the hard disk and the computer, how they work. I knew about some of the key players. I didn't know all of the whole story. But then figuring out how they changed us, that I never even heard of, really.
Mm.
It wasn't even my own upbringing. I mean, I have a PhD in material science. We never talked about these kinds of things. So it felt like it was part of my own learning along the process as I was trying to as I was trying to learn more about what happened and put it into the book.
And so, is there anything that kind of comes up for you as you were doing those investigations and trying to kind of grapple with some of the maybe even the conflicts in your own mind that were like epiphany moments or just things that you learned about these technologies that you knew so well from the hardware side and maybe a little bit from the history side, but where you were like, oh my gosh, this is my mind is open.
Yeah. Well, I'll talk about the last chapter, which is the entitled "Think," which is about the silicon chip. And I knew a
Hmm.
little bit about its evolution. There's a big drama about the people who made the early transistor. There are great movies that you can see on this topic. But there's a little known contributor, and his name is Gordon Teal. And I wanted to focus on him because I resonated with him. He was sort of like this pudgy guy. He was a little awkward. I don't know why I resonated with him. I just liked him. But he was pushed out of the picture. All the physicists were working on this material, on the transistor, and he was a material scientist. He was a chemist, and there's this pecking order. So he was kind of pushed out, but he actually figured out how to make pristine germanium, which is what you need for very reliable devices. And so I was happy to get his story and to learn about him. And I actually got a chance to talk to his son about him as well. But what I found out is that the reason why it's entitled Think is that this technology has shaped the way we think. We have a new relationship with information. And this impacts our creativity. You see, the way we create is that we learn something, it simmers in our subconscious, and then it pops back out as a new idea. But now, because we offload our information to the internet and we don't remember things, we just remember where things are, our creativity is going to be impacted. So we don't know enough about how the brain creates in order to make a firm decision. But that touched me because I was like, now I'm a little concerned because I'm worried about the future generations. How are they going to create? It's certainly going to be different than the way we create. And I don't know if it'll be for the good or for the better or just different. But creativity is definitely going to be impacted by our inventions.
What a fascinating concept that not just because we're offloading all of this information, you're right, and not really holding it in our conscious mind. So when new information comes in, there's nothing there to connect it to.
That's
It's
right.
not, like our what do we call it? Like RAM.
Right,
Like we
right.
can't just go to
We don't
it.
have this, we take in new things and our brain puts them together in new ways. That's how art happens, and that's how we create a new sentence. But if we don't feel like we need to remember anything, then what's the brain working with? And if the computer, let's say your computer's down, what are you going to do? So we have a new relationship with data, but what I'm proposing is that we ought to try and remember things. Just to exercise that muscle. Our brains are very good at doing that. So, we as humans are great at creating, and this is how we encourage it by putting information into our brain and not offloading it.
And then it kind of comes full circle, even going back to the very beginning of your book when you were writing about time and writing about clocks. One of the things that I think is so um, disturbing to me about our modern relationship with work, our modern relationship with time, is that we don't just have moments baked into the day for quiet contemplation or
Mm,
reflection.
mhm.
Even people we think of that do that, like I think of philosophers or I think of um, theoretical astrophysicists, like they have the job where they're privileged to just sit and think, but even their days are scheduled out, and it's so seldom that you get to sit with the entire kind of expectation that there be no expectations, that you're just sitting contemplating and allowing that synthesis that we don't really understand how it works, where creativity really thrives.
That just sounds so beautiful. But no, we don't get that. I feel fortunate as a writer where I can just sit in a library and,
Mm.
read a lot. And then the next day there's some synthesis. I'm using my creativity. I'm using the creative part of my brain. But
Yeah.
because things are so accelerated, our cell phones could ring at any time. We get a tweet, someone wants to share a picture with us. It's really hard to be creative. In fact, I feel fortunate that when I was writing The Alchemy of Us, that I had a really old phone because it just didn't do all the fancy things that distract me today. And I'm a
Mm.
little concerned about my next project. I'm going to have to figure out what to do with my phone. I'm going to have to hide it somewhere because there's just so many things that will just pull my attention. And that's the game that we're in. That's the world that we're in. There's so many things that are pulling at our attention. And if you want to be creative, you've got to figure out how to keep your attention so that you can focus and simmer as we just discussed.
Yeah, it's so funny. It's like there's this movement now to be like an intentional Luddite. You know, like I
I
like, no,
think
it's a choice. It's a choice.
that's right. And I see there's some phones coming out that just have a couple of things, like just a couple of features, just the phone and maybe something else. And I'm like, I think I want to get one of those phones. This is just too much. All these different apps are just giving me notifications and I'm not able to think. So, I mean, for people who need to think, we have to figure out how to keep our attention focused on what we need to work on.
Oh, for sure. I actually don't use notifications on my phone at all. Like
Brilliant.
I'm
Great.
don't get me wrong, I'm the kind of person who's like, I can't live without my iPhone. Like, how did I handle not having a GPS before? I couldn't just Google something the second it popped into my head.
Right.
But that said, I don't want somebody when they text me, I don't want the pressure to feel like I have to respond immediately. I want
I
the
love it.
ball in my court. So
Yeah.
it's like I know I got a text because I chose to pick up my phone and look. I did not, my
Right.
phone didn't tell me that I got a text.
Right. Right.
And
When
that's a
I was
huge thing for me. That's super important.
That's great. When I was writing The Alchemy of Us, I used an old MacBook that I had that
Mhm.
didn't have an updated operating system. And so when I went onto the web, I couldn't get onto pages, and I was like, "Great, go back to writing."
Right.
It was pretty much like a typewriter in some ways, and that's what I had to do to kind of fool myself, just so I wouldn't. Hey, what is that? Let me look that up, and then fall down that rabbit hole.
And it makes me think that there's going to be a new wave of technology. You mentioned the cell phones because there was this hot minute, and I
Mm,
think it's still continuing to some extent, but at least during the pandemic, I haven't been bombarded with the kinds of advertisements that maybe 2, 3 years ago I was, where it was all about fitness trackers and, individual wearables that would tell you things about your body and tell you things
mhm,
about your stress and tell like constant data collection that
mm.
none of us actually do anything with. Like we get this data and it in no way informs the way that we live our lives.
Right, but
And
I don't that data is not for us, though. That data is for the people who are collecting it. So, yeah,
exactly. And
yeah.
there's a growing awareness of that, I think, and there's a growing interest in like a slow movement. And
Mm,
how can we maybe use the brilliant technology that we have not to just indulge, not to just say more, 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 and not to sell our souls to,
mm,
advertising firms,
mhm,
but to actually help ourselves quiet down and to help ourselves be more reflective? How can we use technology in a way that is almost antithetical to
mm.
technology? Because I do think there could be an interesting marriage there in the future.
I think so, but it doesn't help people sell products, us slowing down.
Yeah.
So, and that's the premise. That's the reason why those technologies
Uh,
are out there. And I talked to data scientists and they're like, "Oh, I'm working on this really great project." And what he essentially was telling me was that he was figuring out what people pay attention to. And I said, can you make something that makes us better?" Have you ever thought about that? Like, instead of like figuring out what we're doing and get us to buy something, how about making our lives better? Can you try that angle? And that seemed revolutionary to him. So I think,
oh gosh. Yeah.
but because he was really interested in the problem. He's a mathematician,
Right.
and this is a great mathematics problem. I get it, but your stuff goes into the world, and it's going to change our behavior. Should you be working on that, or can you put some fail safes in there so that life becomes better for us, and not that you're just completely analyzing what we're doing. People aren't asking those questions, and as we talked about, I do think we need to integrate that kind of discussion early in even a mathematics course. This is what will happen with this software. This is what we get from it. Are we making people's lives better?
Absolutely. And I think also, especially from a physical technology perspective, an actual material science perspective, when we're talking about tangible objects, that built into the development and the scalability and then the mass production has to be a consideration about how the physical object exists in the world and what happens to it when it's no longer useful. Because I feel like the space junk sort of parable is the big picture, but also so is the story of plastic on this planet. That there are things that serve us so much and cause a reduction in suffering and cause an improvement in our lives. Yet at the end of their life, they're contributing to a horrific, um, just I don't know what other word to use. Like there's just this disgusting abuse of the
of the
world.
planet. Yeah, I
Yeah.
I would go back to in materials. Sometimes it's the materials that you choose. Like if this
Mm,
material works really well, but you've got to take down that entire mountain to get it.
mhm.
Should we be using this material? Should we use maybe something that's more, as they would call it, earth abundant? It may not have the best properties, but it's kinder to the planet. In science, we're always looking for the, better, faster, stronger, but we never think about, is it better for the planet? Is it recyclable? We should be thinking about that very early on. So yes, uh, we should be looking at the life cycle of products when we have it, of course, when we're enjoying it, what it looks like when we no longer have it. But we should also be looking at how did it start? Where did this come from? There are some materials, particularly in our cell phones, that come from places that are called metals, conflict materials, because they're supporting a lot of human suffering. So we should choose products that don't use those materials, or we should enforce or ask these organizations, these companies, to use recycled versions of those materials so that we don't continue to support human suffering. So there's more to that device that you just have in your hand. It has a story before you got there, and it has a story afterwards.
You're so right. And it's such an important thing to be mindful of. It's such an important thing to think about. And I think so often being able to be mindful of these things, being able to think about these things comes with a basic understanding of the science and the history behind them. And you do such a beautiful job of introducing us to that kind of thinking. So it's not just the storytelling, it's not just the narrative, even though those are so fundamental and so important in your book, but it's also the big takeaways, as you mentioned. And I think the last thing that comes up for me, as I'm looking at these sort of 8 buckets, these 8 inventions, and maybe it's the one that is most salient to me and resonates most for me because I did work as a scientist for many years and then myself became a science communicator.
Mhm.
But this concept of scientific technology, labware, individual things that we utilize when scientists are doing science. And I think that's such a perfect metaphor for the relationship between life and technology, that there are stories to tell, there are questions to be answered, there are problems to be solved in the lab that couldn't be solved until somebody invented a tool to solve it. And then you
Mhm.
use the tool, and then downstream from that came the ability to start solving more problems and answering more questions. And it became this iterative circle. And
Mm.
so rarely do we think about the fact that the tools, the actual physical tools, are nearly as important or more important than what's done with them or than the science themselves, because they they lead downstream to more innovation and more understanding of the world.
That's so well put. I mean, materials are just enablers in a lot of ways, but without them, we wouldn't have been able to get many of the things that we have. So, and glass, as you say, is a perfect example of that. No one really knows who made the first, beaker. Maybe, yeah. But how many things have been made in that? How many medicines have been made because of that? So, and that's kind of how materials are in general. No one really thinks about materials, but everything is made of something, and someone thought about it so that they could select the best material so that it would enable you to do the next thing. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book, because I really wanted to highlight this enabling technology called material science.
Oh, I love it. And it just goes back to the most fundamental things we think about, like when human beings started to develop more sophisticated thoughts, when human beings started to use symbolic language, when they started to name objects, but really when they started to harness and create objects. It's almost like pithy now. It's almost a
Mm.
throwaway to talk about fire or the wheel. But I think the reason those things are so present in our consciousness is because they're these huge examples of all the little things we now see. I'm sitting in my desk and I'm looking into a microphone, into my computer screen. I'm talking to you, by the way, from across the country, which is
Mm-hmm.
amazing in and of
Mm-hmm.
itself. And I've got the table and I've got the book and I've got the iPhone and the little pen and the pad of paper and the glass of water. And these are all things that don't exist in nature in that
That's
form.
right. That's
you
right.
know?
That's right. That's right. And they impact us. I mean, even the simple thing of fire, nobody thinks about that. It's nice to look at on a wintry day. But researchers have seen that it actually has shaped us in terms of it allowed us to grow our brains. See,
Right.
we used to spend a lot of energy when we ate raw meat processing that raw meat, but when we cooked it, we didn't have to spend as much energy, so we use that extra energy to grow our brains. There's a book called Catching Fire about that. And so, I mean, same thing with materials. Clay pots, they don't seem like a lot, but our ability to store food so that vermin didn't eat it gave us free time that we didn't have to harvest every day. And then we can do other things like, I don't know, create language and music and poetry and build civilizations. So clay pots don't seem like much, but they allowed us to do other things. And so that's the beauty of materials. And I don't think we get to crow a lot about materials, but without them, we really wouldn't be here.
You're so right. I mean, it's the reason that we talk about human epics and archaeological findings. I mean, granted, some of it is because the materials are what survive, of course, but some of it is because the entire existence of peoples was defined by the Iron
That's right.
Age,
That's
for
right.
example.
That's right. Bronze Age. Yeah.
It's like,
Exactly.
oh yeah,
Exactly.
once we figured out how to use those materials, bend them to our will and utilize them to, progress, quote unquote, I'm putting that in quotes, however we define it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there was an entire, the globe was swept by these kinds of innovations.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, people changed because of them. And that you're so right. It continues to this day. I think it happens more under our radars. We are less aware of it. And I thank you so much for bringing this back into our consciousness, bringing this back to our attention, and giving us a place and a space to reflect on it. And I think really have gratitude for it. It's about, yes, maintaining the side eye and maintaining the
Right.
skepticism, but it's
Right.
also about sitting and reflecting in real gratitude on how easy we have it today because of all the incredible inventions that came before us.
Thank you. I mean, it's absolutely a celebration in a lot of ways of technology. It's like it's a person in our family, and we accept the good parts of the person in our family, and we also accept the bad parts. But we just have to be honest about that. And so that's what I wanted to do in the Alchemy of Us. I wanted us to celebrate it. I wanted us to geek out on materials, but I also wanted to just introduce another side of them so that we can establish new habits when it comes to all technologies.
Oh, I love it so much. So, Ainissa, before we go, I was hoping that you would take a few moments to reflect on the two big picture questions that I ask all of the guests who visit me on Talk Nerdy. You ready for those questions?
Yeah, I'm ready. I'm a little
All
nervous,
right.
but I'm ready.
Here we go. Take
Okay.
all the time you need. So, when you think about the future, which I imagine you do quite a lot in the work that, in your
Mm.
line of work, number one, what is the thing that really has been keeping you up the most at night? The thing that you've been most concerned about, maybe even a little bit cynical or pessimistic about? And then on the flip side of that, where does your mind go in terms of optimism, in terms of kind of a genuine and authentic place that you're looking forward to?
Those are good questions. I think what keeps me up at night is that we're not capturing all the talent in
Mm,
science and technology, engineering, and math. And great ideas come from different minds, different backgrounds. And there's so many great ideas that are just becoming lost because they just don't make it through the pipeline. And so that kind of keeps me up at night. We can
yeah.
see that we can see that creativity manifests in so many different ways in other arenas. We look at music, we look at art. but science isn't really capturing all of that. So that concerns me. But where I have optimism is that people are finding other channels to become creative. Uh, you know, with the internet, people can connect with each other and make new things that they couldn't before when they were just by themselves. They were isolated. So when people find ways to connect with their tribe, as I like to say, and create new things and bring it up, amplify it so that the rest of the world can see it, that gets me really excited because that's only going to make us all better. It's going to encourage people to get in touch with their own creative side so that they will make something. And it's also going to bring things that we couldn't see before to the forefront. So I'm excited about talent. I'm excited that it's finding a way where there wasn't a way.
Oh, that's so well said. And speaking of these ways that people can maintain connection, get in touch, and feed their creativity, let everybody know where they can hear from you. Where are you posting lately? Where are the outlets where you're writing? And, where can they find you on social media?
Well, The Alchemy of Us is coming out in paperback in April, so you will find me tweeting about it too much about that. I have my own podcast called Science Underground. It's a little, it's sleeping right now because I'm busy writing different articles for different outlets such as Scientific American and National Academies. I'm trying to get top scientists to think about this too. So I've written for the Atlantic and the like, but I'm really trying to get top scientists to think about this too. So you can mostly find me on Twitter, and I have my DMs are open. So send me a message, and if you actually want a signed book plate because COVID, nobody can see each other. I'm happy to send one to you if you send me your address and your name.
Oh, how cool. Everybody, the book is The Alchemy of Us, How Humans and Matter Transformed One Another by Dr. Ainissa Ramirez. Ainissa, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today and your insights. I learned an awful lot, and it really was a pleasure.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much.
And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.